My name is Captain Eric Solberg, and I'm with the Norwegian Special Forces. Most people would call me calm, methodical, and maybe a little obsessive about details. I've always trusted training and instinct over superstition, but that doesn't mean I'm immune to fear. Not here. Not in Svalbard. I'm stationed alone, or mostly alone, at a remote Arctic research outpost named Frosthaven Station, a skeletal structure half buried in ice and wind-swept snow. My mission was simple on paper: investigate a series of radio transmissions that suddenly went dark. No one knew why the messages stopped. No one knew what might be waiting. That's where I come in. Trained to survive, trained to assess threats, trained to get out alive. The wind was the first thing I noticed when I arrived, like it had a voice of its own, whining through the skeletal metal frame of the station, rattling loose panels and freezing my lungs with every breath. The ice beneath my boots groaned as if warning me to turn back. I brushed snow from my jacket and stepped into the main entrance. The air smelled of frost, metal, and the faint underlying odor of something organic, though I couldn't tell if it was the station decaying or something else. Inside, the lights were dim, and the hum of the generator was inconsistent. The flicker made shadows dance across the walls, shadows that didn't always make sense. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion, the long flight, and the weight of the cold pressing against my body. But then something moved in the corner of my eye. A flicker of motion so quick I almost missed it. I spun. Nothing. Just the long, empty corridor, lined with frosted windows staring out to the frozen wasteland beyond. The Arctic is deceptive. The light deceives. The snow deceives. Even your senses deceive. I should have known better. I should have trusted my instincts. My training taught me to scan every shadow, every sound, every shift in the wind. That's why I noticed the first sign, a series of footprints leading from the generator room toward the storage bay. Not human, too long, too narrow, clawed impressions. I followed them with careful steps, my boots crunching the crusted snow inside the station. Every instinct screamed caution. Then I heard it, a sound almost imperceptible at first, like breathing too close to ice. A soft hiss, fleeting, as if the wind itself had whispered a warning. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm. Every nerve in my body prickled. I moved toward the storage bay. The air inside smelled warmer, yet stale, like a body left too long in cold air. My eyes adjusted, scanning crates and frozen equipment. And then I saw it. A scratch mark on the metal wall, deep and jagged, as if some immense claw had tested the integrity of the station. I paused. Not fear, yet, but an uneasy curiosity. The kind you feel before a predator acknowledges your presence. I tried radioing the team, even though I knew the signal was likely dead. Static. Only static. The isolation set in like a weight pressing on my shoulders, a tactile pressure that made the station feel alive, watching me, waiting. Night in the Arctic is a different kind of darkness. Even under the weak glow of the polar sun, or what little of it I could see through frosted windows, the shadows are deep, stretching longer than they should, bending unnaturally over jagged ice and rusted metal. As I moved through the corridors, I noticed details that made my stomach tighten. The subtle scratches along door frames, the small mounds of snow inside the ventilation shafts, as though something had used them like tunnels. Every instinct screamed that I was not alone. Then came the whispers. Not over the radio, not through any device, but in the wind itself. Soft murmurs, fragmented words I couldn't comprehend just beyond comprehension, as if the station was trying to speak to me. My pulse quickened. I've faced gunfire, I've walked through minefields, but this was a predator of a different nature. Patient, intelligent, aware. I could almost feel it mapping me, watching me, anticipating my moves. I checked my gear, my sidearm, my knife, even my survival pack. Standard procedure, but my hands shook slightly despite myself. My mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, traps I could set. That's my training kicking in. Prepare, predict, survive. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the silence that followed, the silence that felt heavier than the blizzard outside. I decided to move to the observation deck. From there, I could see the expanse of ice and rock that stretched endlessly around the station. Maybe seeing it, mapping it, would reassure me, or at least give me a tactical advantage. The door was frozen shut. I pried at it, metal against ice, and finally managed a small opening. And then I saw it, an unnatural shadow at the edge of visibility. A figure barely distinguishable from the frozen landscape, moving with impossible grace and speed. I caught only the reflection of its eyes in the snow, a dull, calculating glint that froze my blood. My training told me to aim, to engage, but instinct screamed for observation. I had one shot at understanding this. Something about it wasn't human, something about it was intelligent, and it knew I was here. I pulled back, silent, moving to cover, my mind racing through scenarios. The Arctic wind carried its scent faintly, a mix of decay and frost, animal and something more ancient. My skin crawled. Every second stretched longer. Every breath was loud. Every heartbeat was an alarm. I knew then that survival wouldn't be about firepower, not entirely. It would be about patience, awareness, and the ability to outthink a predator that could manipulate not only the environment, but perception itself. I had no idea how long I would last. The station groaned behind me as though it were alive and shifting to suit its unknown master. Every step I took echoed in the metal corridors, bouncing off walls lined with frost. My breaths came out in clouds, condensing instantly in the frigid air, and I realized my movements were becoming hyper-cautious, almost animalistic. I was hunting and being hunted without any certainty of which role I truly played. I returned to the generator room to check the equipment to make sure the place wasn't going to leave me stranded. The generator hummed weakly, flickering with erratic power. The monitors displayed faint blips of heat signatures, mostly static, but one, or more, moved too deliberately to be random interference. I crouched, trained eyes scanning every flicker. The patterns suggested something, intelligent, moving in the shadows just beyond infrared range. I forced myself to breathe, counting slowly, trying to impose order on chaos. That's when I heard it again, a soft tapping, deliberate, echoing through the ventilation shafts. My hand went to my sidearm. I listened, letting my training dictate every thought. Soldiers call it quiet awareness, the ability to recognize a threat before it manifests. But the Arctic tests even the best trained instincts. There is no hiding from the cold, no shelter from the wind, and apparently no hiding from this. I tried to recall what I'd learned from previous operations. Small, isolated locations, predators using intelligence and environment to disorient you. My mind flipped through every tactic, traps, distractions, even feints. I decided to move toward the storage bay again, the corridor where the claw marks had been. Maybe understanding its path would give me leverage. The air grew heavier and the shadows darker, almost oppressive. I saw it then, not fully, just fragments. A glint of eyes, movement at the periphery of vision, a distortion in the frost. It mimicked the wind, perhaps even the sound of my own movements. I froze, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence, thicker than before. Then came the whispering again, almost a word this time, too quick for comprehension, like language being broken apart and reassembled by something not human. I realized with a cold certainty that this was no animal, no creature I had ever trained for. This thing thought, observed, learned. It had patience, and patience in a predator is far more dangerous than brute strength. I checked my weapons again. Sidearm loaded, knife at the ready, survival pack strapped tight. But I knew conventional combat might not be enough. This wasn't a firefight, this was a test. And so far, I was losing. I moved slowly through the storage bay, boots crunching on frost, keeping low and silent. Then I saw the first real trace of its intelligence. A set of footprints circling around my own tracks. Not random, but deliberate. It had studied me, mirrored me, anticipated my moves. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I realized I was being stalked, studied like prey on a behavioral analysis board. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally. I felt it more than I saw it, a presence. Close, intelligent, aware of my focus, and using it against me. I tried to remain calm, forcing thoughts of my training forward. slow breathing, situational awareness, escape planning. My mind flicked to the observation deck, the highest point of the station. If I could reach it, I might see its form against the expanse of ice, maybe even predict its movements. The station suddenly shifted under me. Not the wind, not the frost, but the structure itself, groaning like it had been manipulated. My instincts screamed at me, and I ducked behind a support beam just as a panel of metal fell with a violent crash mere inches from where I'd been standing. I could hear it then, a low, wet, rasping, deliberate, intelligent. It didn't come from outside. It came from inside. I knew then that the Arctic isolation, the blizzard, the shadows, they were all weapons in its arsenal. And it wasn't using them randomly. It wanted me to panic. It wanted me to make a mistake. I decided to set a trap of my own. I found a flare and ignited it, casting a sudden, blinding light across the storage bay. The heat was minimal, the illumination temporary, but it bought me seconds. Seconds to scan, seconds to understand. And there it was, briefly illuminated. A figure, humanoid in shape but impossibly thin, its skin a sickly pallor blending into the ice, long, spindly limbs that ended in clawed digits. Its head tilted in a way no human skull should, eyes reflecting the flare with intelligence. It vanished the instant I blinked. The realization hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. This was no mindless predator. It was calculating, learning, perhaps even enjoying the hunt. I felt a surge of adrenaline, sharpening every sense. My training dictated action, but fear whispered that any misstep could be my last. I moved toward the observation deck, using shadows and the weak light of my flare to conceal myself. My ears caught the soft, deliberate mimicry of my own footsteps behind me, taunting, testing. I stopped. My heart pounded. I could feel its presence without seeing it, and that alone was enough to make my skin crawl. I whispered to myself, reciting techniques, recalling scenarios from missions in hostile terrain. One principle remained clear: observe, adapt, survive. Conventional combat wouldn't work. I needed strategy, misdirection. I dropped a flare to the floor, rolled low, and ran to the stairwell leading up. The sound echoed, and for a heartbeat, nothing followed. Then, suddenly, a scraping, a noise like metal claws on metal, descending the stairs I had just vacated. It had anticipated my plan, almost. I reached the observation deck, breathless, muscles screaming. The windows looked out over endless ice, jagged glaciers, and the snow that stretched toward the horizon like a frozen ocean. I scanned, desperate for a glimpse of it, but saw only the white expanse. Yet I felt it, on the ice, moving, circling, aware. It was still out there, waiting, patient. I had survived this encounter. For now, but the questions remained. What was it? How intelligent was it? And most terrifying of all, was it studying me for something more, something I hadn't yet anticipated? I knew the Arctic would be patient, that the night was long, and that whatever I had faced was still out there, watching, calculating, waiting. I stayed in the observation deck longer than I should have, peering through frosted glass, tracing the contours of glaciers and ice ridges. Every movement in the shadows, every gust of wind that carried the taste of frost to my lungs made me jump. I could hear it still, soft, deliberate scraping against metal and ice, circling the station like a predator studying prey. I tried to remind myself, training first, fear second. Yet even that mantra felt fragile here. I had to move. I couldn't stay trapped in observation, waiting for whatever it was to decide I was ready prey. I checked my weapons, sidearm loaded, survival knife sheathed, flare gun ready. My pack contained rations, a small med kit, and a survival radio that might work if I could get the signal. Everything else would be useless against what I was facing. I had no map of its intelligence, no pattern beyond instinct and observation. Improvisation was the only way forward. I crept down the stairwell, listening to the faint hum of the generator below. Every floor creaked under my weight. I paused at the landing to listen. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost human, repeating the exact words I had just muttered to myself, the mantra I had been using to keep calm. My stomach dropped. It could mimic me. It could anticipate me. I realized then that confrontation wouldn't be about brute force. I needed misdirection. I set down a flare and ran toward the west wing, hoping the glow would draw its attention. My boots sank into frost, and I could hear the faint scuffing behind me, faster now, closer, but never quite catching up. I ducked behind a crate and held my breath, feeling the cold seep into my bones, my pulse screaming in my ears. I saw it briefly, illuminated by the flare. Thin, humanoid, limbs elongated, movements unnatural and almost fluid. Its eyes were dark, reflective, unblinking, analyzing me in the same way I analyze a tactical map. It tilted its head and hissed, a sound that made my teeth ache. Then it vanished, melting into shadows like ice dissolving under heat. I realized I needed a plan, a real one, not just evasive maneuvers. The creature was intelligent, yes, but perhaps predictable in some ways. It mimicked, it studied, but it might also be territorial, using the station as its hunting ground. If I could reach the supply room, there were flammable chemicals, propane tanks, cleaning solvents. I could create a barrier, a distraction, maybe even a trap. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow, lined with frost-coated equipment. I moved carefully, listening. Then came a sound that made me freeze, a soft, dragging noise behind me, deliberate and slow. It wasn't just moving, it was stalking. I ducked into a small maintenance alcove and waited. My breath came in visible puffs, sharp and ragged. I counted slowly, trying to control the panic that was creeping in despite every effort. Minutes passed. Then silence. Too long. My instincts screamed that silence in this place wasn't neutral. It was deliberate, waiting. I peeked around the corner. Nothing. The corridor was empty. But I knew better than to trust it. I reached the supply room and quickly scanned the shelves. Propane canisters, industrial solvents, a few boxes of old flares, enough to make a diversion, or maybe more. I set a line of solvent leading toward the center of the room and arranged a couple of flares near it. My hands shook, not with fear, but with adrenaline and exhaustion. I was improvising with incomplete information against a predator that could read me like a book. Then I heard it. Closer this time. It stepped into the doorway, slow, deliberate, observing. It mirrored my movements in the smallest ways, tilting its head, shifting its weight, like a reflection come to life. I held my breath, every muscle coiled, ready to act. The faint reflection of its eyes glinted off the metal shelves. Then, in one motion, I ignited the flares and stepped back, pulling the line of solvent into flames with a match. The room erupted in light and fire. Heat hit my face, smoke stung my eyes, and the creature screamed, if that's what the sound was, more of a rasp, a mixture of pain and anger. It retreated, slipping into shadows and vents, leaving a chilling emptiness behind. I took the moment to escape, sprinting down a side corridor toward the exit, ignoring the burn in my lungs and the sting of smoke in my eyes. Outside, the Arctic night had deepened. The wind cut through me like knives, but I ran anyway, my boots sinking into the icy crust. I didn't look back, didn't dare. I needed distance, even if I knew it might not be enough. The creature had studied the station. It had studied me. I could run, but it would learn, adapt, and perhaps return. I reached a small ridge overlooking the station, gasping for breath, snow burning my exposed skin. The horizon was empty, but I could feel the presence, the intelligence lingering in the darkness. Watching, waiting. My mind reeled with the possibilities. Was it native to this region? A mutation? Something ancient, waiting for intruders like me? I activated my survival radio, hoping for a signal. Static. Then faintly a voice. Not human, not quite, but mimicking the tones of a distress call I'd heard in training simulations. I cut the signal, panic surging. It could mimic radio transmissions now. It could lie, deceive, manipulate. There was no certainty. I huddled against the wind, body numb, muscles screaming, mind racing. I had survived this encounter, but the creature's presence was no longer confined to the station. It had learned, it had adapted, and I knew deep down that it wasn't done. The Arctic stretched around me, empty, frozen, silent. But the knowledge that I was being watched, studied, and anticipated made it feel alive, oppressive, predatory. I could survive the night, maybe even escape the station, but the questions remained. The thing in Frosthaven wasn't just a predator, it was something beyond understanding, patient, intelligent, and still out there. I tightened my gear, pulled my hood over my face, and began moving away from the station toward the uncertain safety of the frozen expanse. Every step echoed in my mind: survive, adapt, observe. But the wind whispered back, soft and deliberate, carrying a sound I knew I recognized: the faint, deliberate tapping of claws on metal. Waiting, learning, patient. I realized then with a cold, sinking certainty I had survived, yes, but I was not free. Not truly. And Frosthaven still held its secrets, its predator, and the darkness that had now marked me as prey. I trudged across the frozen plain, every step heavy with exhaustion, yet my senses screamed that the predator hadn't let me go. The Arctic wind was merciless, cutting through layers of gear and numbing exposed skin, but I forced myself onward. My eyes flicked constantly, scanning the horizon, tracing every shadow, every glint of ice, looking for even the faintest hint of movement. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. That calculated, patient intelligence tracking me just beyond my vision. I found a small depression in the ice, a natural alcove shielded from the worst of the wind. I sank into it, crouching low, trying to control my breathing. My pulse still rattled my chest like a drum. The adrenaline that had kept me running now fed my paranoia. Every groan of the ice beneath my feet sounded like a warning. Every distant gust of wind carried a whisper that my mind almost recognized, but not entirely. Something mimicked, twisted, deceived. Something out there was learning from me. I tried to rationalize, as I always do. Perhaps it was a predator, yes, but maybe not sentient in the human sense. Perhaps it was an animal evolved in isolation, adapting in ways I couldn't understand. And yet, the way it mimicked my voice, the way it anticipated my moves, it wasn't instinct alone. No animal could calculate with such precision. It had intelligence, and that intelligence was cold, patient, and deliberate. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, the Arctic blurring time into an endless gray. My body ached. My breath burned, my mind spun theories, possibilities, contingencies. Survival was no longer just physical, it had become a mental game. I couldn't let fear dictate my movements, but fear was a constant companion here, and a rational thought at odds with instinct. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, distant but unmistakable. Claws on ice. I froze. Every nerve in my body tensed. My training told me to prepare for confrontation, yet I had no weapons capable of stopping it permanently. The station had been a controlled environment. Here, in the open Arctic, I had nothing, and I knew it. I forced myself to move, low and deliberate, following a ridge that led to a slightly more stable expanse of snow. My eyes scanned every shadow, every crease in the ice. I could almost sense it watching, anticipating, learning. My mind raced for strategies, for diversions, for any way to escape its calculation. My hands shook slightly, not with fear alone, but with the exhaustion of constant alertness. Suddenly, a shape flickered in the periphery, too fast to be an optical illusion. I spun, sidearm raised, but saw nothing, just snow, ice, and the emptiness of the horizon. Yet the certainty remained. It was there, always there, patient, calculating, waiting. I remembered the small supply of flares I had left. I ignited one, letting the sudden light flare across the icy plain. It was a gamble, a beacon, and I knew it. A few seconds later I heard it, the rasping, hissing sound of claws scraping ice, retreating slightly. The creature had reacted, but not aggressively. It was probing, testing, learning again. I realized then that every move I made, every tactic I employed, was being observed and cataloged. I wasn't just surviving, I was teaching it. The sun, weak and low, began its slow descent behind distant ridges. I had to find shelter before darkness fully claimed the Arctic. A ruined cabin appeared faintly in the distance, half buried in ice. I moved toward it cautiously, aware that every crunch of snow underfoot, every breath I exhaled, was audible in this barren land. The creature didn't give chase, at least not immediately. Perhaps it was waiting for darkness to gain the advantage, or perhaps it understood that forcing a confrontation now would reveal its position. The cabin offered some protection from the wind, though little from the mind-bending isolation. I entered cautiously, inspecting every corner. Old furniture lay scattered, frost coating the floorboards. I barricaded the door as best I could with broken planks, lit the remaining flares, and tried to calm my mind. I knew this was temporary. The Arctic night would fall completely, and with it, the predator's patience would become a threat once more. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to gather strength, to let the adrenaline fade into exhaustion. My hands were raw from the cold, my lungs burned. Yet even in that brief reprieve, I could feel the lingering presence outside. Not visible, not fully, but tangible. The Arctic itself seemed alive with it. I had survived, yes, but the creature, whatever it was, remained out there, patient, intelligent, and endlessly adaptive. I thought of Frosthaven Station, the claw marks, the whispers, the mimicry. I thought of every step I had taken, every plan I had improvised, and I understood the truth. I had won a battle, perhaps, but the war was far from over. The Arctic had many secrets, and this predator, this intelligence, had chosen to reveal only fragments. I was prey, yes, but a very clever prey. Clever enough to survive for now. Hours later, or maybe only minutes, it's impossible to measure time in the frozen wastes, I heard the faintest whisper through the wind, almost human, almost taunting. My pulse quickened. I gripped my sidearm, ready, alert, but I knew there was nothing I could do. It didn't need to attack. It only needed to exist, to wait, to study, to haunt. I settled into a corner of the cabin, shivering, heart hammering, aware that the Arctic night was long and merciless. Outside, the wind howled across glaciers and ice ridges, carrying the faint, deliberate sound of claws scraping frozen metal, or perhaps just ice. It didn't matter. I knew now that it was watching, learning, and it would never forget me. And I knew with a cold certainty that Frosthaven Station had not given up its secrets. The creature had survived longer than anyone expected. I had survived longer than anyone expected. But the Arctic, vast and patient, still held mysteries I might never understand. And the predator, intelligent and waiting, was still out there. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and whispered a mantra to myself: training, survival, endurance. And somewhere in the darkness, I felt the faintest response. Almost a whisper carried on the wind, almost acknowledgement. I was alive, for now, but I was not free, not truly. And Frosthaven Station, and whatever lurked in the Arctic beyond it, was still there, patient, watching, waiting. My name is Alexander Varga, a former Hungarian Special Forces operative who turned survival instructor after years of service. I've always been stubborn, methodical, and haunted by the kind of silence most men try to fill with noise. I tell myself I retired to help people, civilians who wanted to learn the basics of wilderness survival, but the truth is simpler. I've been trying to lose the ghosts that follow me. War never leaves your bones, and the stillness of nature has always been the closest thing to peace I've found. That's why I accepted this job in Alaska's Brooks Range, deep into a corner of wilderness few people dare to tread. A wealthy client had funded a private research outpost here decades ago, long since abandoned, and he wanted me to assess its condition before sending a team in to reclaim it. A few weeks of solitude, fresh air, and discipline suited me fine. Besides, I've always trusted my skills more than the hands of strangers. From the moment the bush plane lifted away, leaving me with crates of supplies and the guttural scream of the wind, I felt the weight of the place. The sky was low, bruised with shifting layers of cloud that dragged shadows across the jagged ridges. The air smelled sharp, metallic, as if the rocks themselves bled iron. My boots sank into a frost-crusted soil that crunched like brittle bone. A silence clung to the valley. A silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, pressing into the chest until each breath seemed louder than it should be. The outpost was a cluster of 3 low, prefabricated huts, half buried by years of snowdrift and neglect. Windows were frosted over from the inside, doors swollen against their frames. I forced one open with the butt of my hatchet, the stale air breathing out in a rush, thick with mold and something stranger, like wet copper. It should have ended there. a forgotten camp, a job too small to stir fear in a man like me. But even in those first hours, as I set about securing firewood and inventorying rations, small things unsettled me. The first was the sound, not the wind. Alaskan winds are alive. They howl and claw and whistle through every seam, but this was different. It came low, almost subsonic, like a vibration rising from the earth itself. Sometimes it pressed against my eardrums without warning, fading just as quickly. At first I thought it was my imagination, the memory of military engines or artillery tremors echoing in my nerves. But when I placed a metal canteen on the table, I watched it quiver. The earth was humming beneath me. The second was the light. Sunset here dragged on for hours, painting the ridges in long, bleeding hues of red and violet. As the shadows stretched, I noticed the tree line seemed closer. I know how fatigue can trick the eye, but these were black spruces rooted deep into frozen soil, yet their edges shifted, leaning as though inching toward the cabins. I told myself it was nothing. That's what men like me do. Dismiss what doesn't fit the field manual. Focus on the controllable. Secure the perimeter. Keep the fire alive. But when night came, the temperature plummeted with an abruptness that stunned me. My breath crystallized the moment it left my lips, and the walls of the hut popped and groaned as if shrinking inward. I sat with my rifle across my knees, listening. The hum in the earth had grown steadier now, and with it came a faint rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, almost like a heartbeat. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I paced the room, running my fingers along the warped plywood walls, testing my knife's edge by lamplight, and staring at the black windows where frost feathered like white fire. My instincts were telling me something was wrong. Not enemy patrols, not ambush, but the same animal instinct I'd felt in foreign deserts just before an IED went off. A silence that sharpens. When I finally stepped outside, the cold carved into my lungs like glass shards. The moon had risen low over the ridges, and the snowfields glowed with a strange, almost liquid sheen. I scanned the tree line through my rifle scope, methodical sweeps left to right. At first, nothing, then movement. Not the sway of branches, not an animal breaking cover. No, this was the ground itself. The snow at the tree line shifted, bulged, as though something vast and slow moved beneath the crust. The beat I'd felt through the earth seemed louder here. A deep thrum syncing with my pulse. I lowered the scope, heart hammering, and for the first time in years I whispered aloud without meaning to. "What the hell are you?" The snow stilled. The hum ceased. And in the silence that followed, I realized I was standing alone in a wilderness older than any war, with no backup, no extraction, and no way of knowing what slept beneath my feet. Sleep never came. I stayed by the window, watching the tree line, my body aching from the tension of hours spent unmoving. By dawn, the horizon cracked with pale light, washing the ridges in a dull gray that stripped the world of all warmth. The humming had faded, but I couldn't shake the memory of it. The way it crawled into my bones like a vibration meant for something deeper than hearing. I forced myself into routine. Routine is what keeps men alive in places like this. Fire, water, food, patrol. The outpost had a narrow well shaft dug decades ago, capped with a rusted metal grate. I chipped through the ice, lowered a bucket, and pulled up water that shimmered oddly in the morning light. It looked normal enough, but when I poured some into my canteen, I caught the faintest smell again, that same copper tang I'd noticed inside the cabin. Metallic, wet, almost like blood diluted with snowmelt. I dumped it out. My throat burned with thirst, but instincts screamed louder. Never drink what feels wrong. The forest was silent. No birds, no tracks in the snow but my own, not even the faint rustle of rabbits or foxes. That was the next thing that gnawed at me. Silence, this complete is unnatural. In combat zones, silence meant ambush. Here it meant the land itself was holding its breath. I started inspecting the cabins more thoroughly. The first was storage. Rotted crates, scraps of paper with faded notes, and equipment too corroded to be useful. The second was living quarters, 3 narrow cots and a cracked stove. The third was different. Inside were filing cabinets, most gutted, but in the back corner, behind a fallen shelf, I found a locked metal trunk. The paint was blistered, the hinges corroded, but the padlock was still solid. It wasn't my mission to pry into old research. My job was to check structures, not dig through someone's secrets. But something in me resisted leaving it closed. Maybe it was habit, intelligence gathering drilled into my blood. Or maybe it was the silence pressing so hard against my thoughts that I needed distraction. I set the trunk upright, pulled my hatchet, and broke the lock with 3 sharp blows. Inside were folders wrapped in waxed cloth, still surprisingly intact. I flipped through brittle papers filled with diagrams I couldn't fully understand. Geological surveys, seismic charts, notes about resonant frequencies. One line stuck with me, scribbled in a frantic hand across the margin of a page. It is not tectonic. It listens. I stopped cold. The words vibrated in my skull like the hum itself. Whoever wrote this had felt the same thing I did, the heartbeat in the earth. That was when the sound returned. It started as a pulse beneath my boots, faint but steady. Then the trunk rattled against the floor, the papers fluttering as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. My ears popped as if pressure had shifted, and the copper smell thickened until bile rose in my throat. I staggered back outside into the cold, gasping for air. The snow around the cabins was trembling, subtle ripples spreading outward as though the ground was water and something vast was rising beneath. My soldier's mind snapped to action. Rifle ready, eyes scanning arcs, breath controlled. But what does training matter when the ground itself moves? The vibrations subsided after a minute, leaving the valley silent again, but the damage was done. I couldn't dismiss it anymore. Something was down there. Something alive. I spent the afternoon reinforcing the main cabin, barred the door, stacked firewood inside, laid out supplies for quick reach. Old instincts took over, secure a fallback point, plan for siege. It felt absurd, preparing defenses against the earth. But routine calmed me. If there was a threat, I would meet it with discipline. Night came early. I sat by the stove, chewing dried meat, when I noticed the frost patterns spreading across the window. Not the usual branching crystals, these were concentric rings, perfect circles radiating outward like ripples in frozen water. My hand tightened on the rifle, then came the sound, not just the hum, a voice. It was faint, distorted, as though carried through layers of stone, but I swear it spoke my name. Alexander. I froze, every muscle screaming. The rifle clattered slightly as my grip trembled. Who's there? I barked, voice too loud in the tiny room. My words steamed in the air, dissipating against the window's frost. Silence followed, but the frost patterns shifted, the rings tightening as though something on the other side of the glass leaned closer. I forced myself to breathe. Fear is a weapon, and I would not hand it control. I whispered the mantra drilled into me in training: observe, assess, act. But what do you do when the land itself whispers your name? I barely slept again. My dreams were a blur of pressure and red light pulsing behind my eyelids. When I woke, my body was stiff, my mouth dry as bone, and the frost on the window had spelled something new. 3 jagged lines intersecting like a crude mark. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, and it meant I wasn't alone. By the 3rd day, the silence was no longer background. It was a predator circling the camp. I moved through the snow like a man tracked, every step too loud, every exhale fogging the air like a signal flare. I carried my rifle even inside the cabin, barrel never more than a hand's breadth away. The mark on the window frost stayed with me. 3 intersecting lines, etched not by chance but by intention. I tried wiping it clean with my glove, but by the next morning, it returned. Same lines, same crude precision. I began searching the perimeter more aggressively. Old training habits guided me, low sweeps, tracking impressions, scanning for disturbances, and I found them. Not footprints, not claw marks. The snow at the tree line had collapsed in narrow, elongated depressions, as though something vast pressed upward and then sank back down. They weren't consistent like animal tracks. They were testing, pushing against the surface, then retreating. I crouched beside one, brushing away loose snow. The indentation was deeper than my arm, walls smooth, as if heat or pressure had melted a shaft straight down. The copper tang in the air grew stronger near these depressions, stinging my nostrils until my stomach turned. That was when I heard it. A low grinding sound beneath the snow, like stone dragged across stone, but it had rhythm. The same 3-beat pulse I'd felt since arriving. This time it was louder, resonating in my chest. I backed away, rifle raised, waiting for something to emerge. The snow bulged, cracked, then stilled. Silence fell again, but I knew, without question, something down there had heard me. Back inside the cabin, I spread the research papers across the table, forcing myself to study them by lamplight. My pulse hammered, my hands restless. The notes spoke of subterranean anomalies, of oscillations unbound by tectonic activity. A phrase repeated often, non-geological resonance. And then scrawled in what looked like dried blood across the back of one page, if it learns your frequency, it will not stop. I didn't want to believe it, but the thought drilled into my skull. The hum wasn't random. It was probing, listening, learning. That night, the confrontation came closer. I woke to the stove popping, flames guttering low. The room was dark, except for embers. At first, I thought the sound was the wind pressing against the walls. But no, it was inside. A deep, vibrating growl reverberated through the floorboards, rattling the dishes in my canteen. I grabbed the rifle and crouched low, listening. The growl rose into a resonance that seemed to bend the air. My teeth ached, my vision blurred, and then the voice again, clearer this time. Alexander. The floor under me bulged. Boards warped upward, splitting along the seams as if something massive pressed from beneath. I stumbled back, raising the rifle, sweat freezing on my skin despite the cold. A crack split the floor open, a jagged line racing toward me. For a heartbeat, I glimpsed movement below. Not flesh, not stone, but something shifting, translucent, like light bent through water. Then the crack sealed itself with a hiss, leaving only frost on the broken boards. My hands shook. I'd faced men with rifles, explosives, fire, but this was beyond tactics or training. This was something older, patient, and far more intelligent than anything I'd fought before. I stayed awake till dawn, rifle aimed at the floor, every muscle wired tight. When sunlight finally broke through the window, I saw it again. The mark in the frost had changed. No longer 3 intersecting lines. Now it formed a crude circle, with lines radiating outward. A map, a warning, or an invitation. I didn't know which was worse. That morning, the silence was broken for the first time. Not by animals, not by wind, but by the earth itself groaning like a wounded giant. A tremor rolled through the valley, shaking snow from the roofs, splitting ice along the well. The vibration pulsed in rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. The message was clear. It wasn't just beneath me, it was rising. By the 4th night, the valley no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like a cage. The ridges pressed closer, the tree line loomed heavier, and the cabins themselves creaked as though shrinking beneath the weight of something unseen. I didn't waste time anymore pretending routine would save me. Every motion now was survival-driven. I double-checked ammunition, sharpened blades, packed my essentials into one rucksack in case retreat became possible. Still, retreat to where? The bush plane wasn't due for another week, and there was no radio signal this deep in the Brooks Range. I was alone. The tremors had grown stronger. Every few hours the ground would throb with that impossible rhythm, rattling the metal trunk and fluttering the papers as though stirred by wind. I stopped marking the frost on the window. It changed every time I looked. New symbols, lines, circles, even crude shapes that resembled eyes. Watching. It came for me that night. I was awake. Sleep had become a memory when the first groan shook the cabin. Not subtle like before, but a violent heave that knocked my lantern to the floor. I rolled aside just as the board split open with a crack like gunfire. The floor erupted. Snow and ice burst upward through the gaps, carried on a column of black frost that writhed as if alive. My rifle was in my hands before I thought, muzzle flashing as I fired into the eruption. The report was deafening in the small cabin, but the rounds vanished into the thing without resistance, as though I were shooting into fog. The shape wasn't solid, not flesh, not stone. It shimmered like translucent ice, shifting with each pulse. But it reacted. When my shots rang out, the hum beneath my feet surged louder, the rhythm accelerating. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. Then it spoke again. Louder, clearer, not just my name. Alexander, stay. The voice wasn't sound in the air, it was inside me. My teeth vibrated, my skull rattled, blood dripped from my nose. I staggered back, firing again, then dropped the rifle when my vision warped as though the air bent around the thing. Instinct screamed, fire, heat, destruction. I lunged for the stove. With both hands, I grabbed the iron grate, ignoring the searing pain as the heat burned my palms. I wrenched it free, sending embers flying. The moment I hurled the burning coals onto the floorboards, the entity recoiled. The hum faltered, dipping into silence. The frost evaporated where the embers struck. The black frost retreated back into the crack, writhing like a wounded animal. The floor sealed itself again with a hiss, leaving scorch marks across the wood. I collapsed against the wall, gasping. My hands blistered, skin split and raw. The pain grounded me, pulled me back from the brink of panic. It hated the heat. That much I understood. But as the silence returned, a deeper fear settled in my chest. It hadn't been trying to kill me outright. Not yet. The way it whispered, the way it formed symbols, the way it retreated rather than finishing me, it was testing. Studying. Like I was the experiment. I wrapped my hands, forced myself to think like the soldier I once was. Enemies with superior strength demand adaptation. Find their weakness, exploit it. Fire seemed to work, but only briefly. Still, one thought gnawed at me as I stared at the broken floor. It knew my name before I ever spoke it aloud. And if it could learn that much, what else had it already taken from me? I sat there until dawn, rifle across my knees, stove burning hotter than ever, trying not to listen to the faint hum that never truly stopped beneath the ground. The next day was the first time I truly considered leaving the outpost behind. Not because I'm the kind of man who runs, but because staying felt like volunteering for dissection. Yet the wilderness outside was worse than a battlefield. The Brooks Range stretches into nothing, white, jagged, and merciless. Without radio, without map trails, without the plane, I would vanish just as surely as if the thing dragged me into the ground. So I stayed. And staying meant preparing for war. I tore apart the storage hut for anything combustible, old fuel cans, stacks of warped paper, crates splintered into kindling. I built fire pits at each corner of the cabin, crude but functional, ready to be lit in seconds. I even rigged a Molotov or two from bottles I found, strips of cloth twisted into wicks. Primitive weapons, but I had learned long ago. Any weapon is enough if you use it with conviction. The research papers haunted me. If it learns your frequency, it will not stop. The words crawled across my brain. I thought about the hum, about how it changed when I reacted. It wasn't just random, it was listening to me, maybe even adjusting to me. That evening, I stepped outside deliberately, rifle slung but unraised. The sky was clear, a smear of stars so sharp they looked like they could cut the dark. The snow reflected them, turning the valley into an ocean of cold light. I stood at the tree line, heart hammering. "I know you hear me," I said. My voice felt stupid, fragile against the silence. "You wanted me here. Why?" For a long moment, nothing. Then the ground vibrated. Snow spilled from the branches. The hum swelled into my chest, and the voice rolled through me like thunder underwater. "Alexander, stay." The snow shifted at my feet. A fissure cracked open, narrow but deep, glowing faintly with a pale, impossible light from below. My instincts screamed to retreat, but discipline locked my legs. I pulled a Molotov, lit it, and hurled it into the fissure. The explosion was small, a rush of fire and broken glass. But the reaction, it was like throwing acid into flesh. The hum split into a shriek so piercing my vision blurred white. The fissure snapped shut, snow geysering upward in a plume. I staggered back, rifle raised, ears ringing. For a moment, I believed I'd won some ground, but the valley itself seemed to groan in reply. The ridges echoed the hum back and forth until the sound became a chorus, layered, endless. Not one voice. Many. And then I understood. It wasn't just beneath me. It was everywhere. The outpost hadn't been built here by chance. It was planted in the heart of something vast, something alive. That night, I couldn't hold still. Every creak of the cabin, every flicker of the stove flame put me on edge. I paced like a caged wolf, whispering plans, running fingers over weapons, rereading notes until the words blurred. Sleep finally took me, and that's when it struck hardest. I dreamed of soil pressing against my skin, of frost climbing into my veins. I dreamed I was buried alive beneath endless snow. But worse, I dreamed I was moving, pulled through the earth by something that cradled me gently, like a child carried home. When I woke, my body was soaked in sweat despite the freezing air. My hands shook as I reached for the rifle. The frost on the window had changed again. This time, it wasn't symbols. It was my face. Crude, jagged, but unmistakable, my own eyes staring back from the ice. And in the silence, the hum rose again. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Louder than ever. It wasn't testing anymore. It was calling. By then I understood. The real war wasn't on the surface. It was inside me. I tried ignoring it, forcing myself into drills, push-ups until my muscles trembled, stripping and cleaning the rifle by rote. But the hum threaded itself through everything. 3 beats, pause. A rhythm I couldn't escape. I tapped it unconsciously against the table, ground my teeth in time with it, even caught myself breathing to its cadence. The thing wasn't just beneath me anymore. It was inside my head, pulling strings. I burned the frost face off the window with a torch, but it reformed an hour later. This time it smiled. That broke something in me. I stormed outside with the rifle, boots sinking deep into the snow. The sky was white and endless, the ridges frozen like teeth around the valley. I shouted until my voice tore. "I'm not your prey. You want me? Come out and fight me." For a moment, silence. Then the ground cracked wide 30 paces ahead. Not a fissure this time, but an opening, a ragged mouth in the snow that glowed faintly from within. Warm breath rose into the air, steaming. Every instinct screamed, "Do not go closer." But my legs carried me forward anyway. Rifle aimed, steps crunching over the crust. The hum surged so loud it rattled my ribcage. I froze at the edge, staring into the dark below. The light wasn't natural. It pulsed like veins, alive. Shadows shifted deep inside, moving not with random current, but with intention. And then, voices. Not one, but many. Hundreds, thousands. They whispered in different tongues, overlapping, yet all converged into one name. Alexander. I fell to my knees, hands clamped over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was in my blood. My vision swam. Images flashed behind my eyes, faces from years past. My unit laughing in some godforsaken desert. Then the same men dead, mouths open in silent screams. My mother, frail and smiling at me before deployment. Then her eyes hollow, lips black with frost. I slammed the rifle butt into the snow, forcing myself upright. "No," I growled through gritted teeth. "You don't get to use them." The fissure trembled as though laughing. Snow collapsed inward, closing until only a thin seam remained. The hum receded, leaving me panting in the silence. But the silence wasn't relief. It was victory. The thing had proven its reach, able to pluck memories like strings, able to dig through my past as though it belonged to it. Back inside, I barricaded the door and stoked the fire until the walls glowed with heat. My hands were shaking, but not just from fear, from rage. This thing thought it could wear me down, unravel me piece by piece. Fine, let it try. I dragged the metal trunk closer to the fire, spreading the research pages again. One note I'd skimmed earlier caught my eye now, underlined in heavy strokes. Combustion disrupts resonance. Combustion. Fire. That explained why the stove and Molotov had worked. The heat broke its rhythm, fractured its song. But another line chilled me. Prolonged exposure leads to synchronization. Subject cannot distinguish own will from signal. I clenched the paper in my fists. Already I could feel it. How easy it was to slip into the hum's rhythm, how natural it felt to obey the cadence. Every minute I stayed here, I risked becoming nothing more than another voice in its chorus. I had a choice. Burn it out, or let it consume me. As night fell again, I poured the last of the fuel into the stove, the flames roaring high. My shadow stretched across the walls, flickering, trembling. I held the rifle tight, watching the frost creep across the window once more. This time, it didn't form a face, it formed a doorway. The frost spread wide across the window until the entire pane shimmered white. At first, it was just more patterns, concentric lines, jagged angles. But then it shifted, coalescing into something unmistakable. A doorway, outlined with perfect clarity, framed in frost like it had been carved from the ice itself. It wasn't just a picture. The longer I stared, the more I felt my body leaning toward it, my thoughts drifting into its frame. My breath slowed until I caught myself inhaling in time with the hum again. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. I stumbled back, nearly knocking the stove over. My blistered palms screamed as I gripped the rifle tighter, grounding myself in pain. This wasn't just a trick of the frost. It was an invitation, a lure, and, God help me, a part of me wanted to accept. I remembered the dream, being carried gently through the earth as if welcomed home. The hum wasn't just sound anymore, it was comfort, promise. The voice of something vast, older than the ridges, telling me I could stop fighting, stop resisting. Just step through the door and stay. But I am not a man who surrenders, not to enemies with rifles, not to the ghosts that followed me after war, and not to this. I ripped down the curtain and covered the window, blocking the frost door from view. My heart thundered. Sweat ran cold down my back. Blocking it helped, but only barely. The image lingered behind my eyes, as if etched into the inside of my skull. The cabin groaned suddenly, timbers flexing inward as though pressed by invisible hands. Snow sifted down from the rafters. I rushed to the stove, feeding in the last splinters of wood, forcing the fire higher. The pressure eased slightly, but not enough. Then I heard it, outside, a sound I hadn't heard since I arrived. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. I froze, rifle raised, eyes locked on the door. The steps were deliberate, slow, circling the cabin, not animal, too heavy, too measured. My breath fogged the air in quick bursts as I tracked it, every muscle primed. Then, a voice. Not the subterranean rumble this time, a human voice muffled through the walls. Help. Please. The words clawed at me. I hadn't seen another soul since the pilot dropped me here. Every instinct screamed trap, yet the soldier in me couldn't ignore a call for help. I cracked the door, rifle aimed into the night. The snow reflected starlight, blinding in its stillness. No one there. Only tracks, fresh, leading toward the tree line. I followed. Slowly, carefully, rifle up. The tracks were shallow depressions, human-shaped, leading straight to the edge of the forest. Then they stopped. The last footprint sank halfway into the snow, as though whoever made it had stepped down and vanished. The hum surged again, vibrating through the ground into my chest. And in that moment I understood. The voice had been for me. The tracks had been for me. It was building the doorway not just in frost, but in my mind, in my instincts. It wanted me to follow. I retreated step by step, never turning my back until the cabin door slammed shut behind me. My chest heaved, lungs burning. The frost curtain had fallen. The window was bare again, but the doorway remained, etched in perfect clarity, glowing faintly with pale light. It wasn't a trick anymore. It was real. The doorway glowed faintly in the frost, pulsing with the same rhythm that had wormed its way into my bones. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Pause. Each pulse tugged at me, pulling on something deeper than muscle or thought, pulling on will itself. I sat on the floor, rifle across my knees, fire crackling in the stove like the only heartbeat that was mine. My hands shook, not from cold but from the terrible weight of choice. Burn it down. That was the soldier's answer. Destroy the doorway before it destroyed me. A blaze hot enough to fracture the resonance, scatter the frost, and leave nothing for it to feed on. But burning the cabin meant losing shelter. Out there, in the endless snow and silence, I wouldn't last long, or I could step closer. See what waited beyond, accept the invitation, but that wasn't exploration, that was surrender. The hum rose as though sensing my hesitation. My teeth vibrated, ears filling with the whispers of voices I'd buried years ago, men I'd served with, men I'd lost. My mother's voice, gentle, calling my name. For one moment, I swayed forward, knees bent to rise. My body wanted to obey, to walk into that pale glow and let the struggle end. But discipline is a chain forged in pain and blood. I gritted my teeth, slammed the rifle butt into the floor, and shouted into the silence, "You don't get to choose for me!" The cabin shuddered violently. Frost exploded across the walls, racing in jagged lines. The stove roared as if in answer, flames whipping high. I staggered to my feet, ripping open the old fuel canisters I'd hoarded. My blistered hands screamed as I sloshed fuel across the walls onto the floorboards. The doorway pulsed brighter, faster, like a heartbeat racing into frenzy. The hum grew deafening, the voices overlapping into a chorus. "Stay, stay, Alexander, stay!" I lit a Molotov, the rag wick flaring. My arm trembled as I raised it, staring at the frost door one last time. For a second, it wasn't a doorway anymore. It was a vision of home. My unit alive, laughing by a fire. My mother waiting with arms open. A world where war had never touched me. Tears burned my eyes. My grip faltered. Then I hurled the bottle. Glass shattered, fire bloomed, and the cabin became an inferno. The frost shrieked as it melted, steam hissing from the walls. The doorway pulsed once, twice, then shattered like glass, fragments of light scattering into the night. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I staggered outside as flames devoured the cabin, smoke streaming into the frozen air. The cold bit deep, but I welcomed it. It was real, solid, mine. I collapsed into the snow, chest heaving, watching my only shelter burn. For a moment I thought I had won, but then the ridges echoed with a new sound. Not the hum, a groan. Low, immense, rolling through the valley like thunder from a throat too vast to imagine. The snow trembled beneath me. The fire hadn't killed it, it had only woken it fully, and now it knew I would never stay. The cabin burned like a beacon in the valley, flames clawing against the night sky, smoke coiling into the stars. I knelt in the snow, heat on my face, cold on my back, and the realization sinking deep. I had destroyed my only safe haven. But it wasn't safety I felt. It was exposure. The groan rolled again, deeper, louder, shaking the ridges until snow cascaded from the slopes. The ground quivered beneath me, not in quick bursts, but in a slow, steady rhythm, like a body shifting after long sleep. I clutched the rifle tight, but it felt like a child's toy against whatever stretched beneath the earth. I forced myself to move. A soldier dies when he freezes. Indecision is as lethal as a bullet. I staggered toward the storage hut, dragging the pack I'd prepared. Most supplies were gone now, consumed by fire, but I salvaged what I could: ammo, a little food, the last of the paper maps. My hands burned with every motion, blisters split and raw, but pain kept me sharp. The snow around me rippled. Not just tremors now, it moved in waves, circles spreading outward from the cabin's ruins. The firelight flickered across the drifts, and I saw shapes beneath, vast, shifting shadows like serpents swimming under ice. I ran. Each step broke crust, plunging into snow that seemed softer than before, like walking across the skin of something alive. The rifle swung heavy against my chest, pack dragging me down. Breath tore in and out, steaming in frantic bursts. Behind me, the cabin collapsed, sparks scattering like fireflies, and with its fall came the voices again, no longer muffled or distorted. They were clear, sharp, echoing from everywhere at once. "Alexander, Alexander, stay, stay." I dropped to one knee, leveled the rifle, and fired into the snow, where a shadow pulsed beneath. The report cracked through the valley, muzzle flash blinding against the dark. The snow exploded upward, but the shadow didn't bleed, didn't flinch. It simply dissolved and reformed farther off, circling. They were toying with me, hurting me. I pushed on, stumbling toward the tree line. The black spruces loomed tall and thin, skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Between them, darkness pooled so thick it felt solid. The copper tang grew stronger the closer I came, until every breath tasted metallic, hot, wrong. When I reached the first line of trees, the hum returned. Not from the ground this time, from the trunks themselves. The bark vibrated under my palm when I leaned against one, the rhythm pounding through wood like veins carrying a heartbeat. The forest was not refuge, it was part of them. I stumbled back into the clearing, chest heaving, mind racing. Fire was my only weapon, but I had little left to burn. The open snow made me visible, but at least it wasn't singing to me. The valley groaned again, and the ridges answered like a chorus. Snow cascaded from the peaks in slow avalanches. The shadows beneath the ground pulsed in circles around me, tightening. I stood alone in the clearing, rifle raised, flames dying behind me, breath crystallizing in air so cold it cut like glass. My mind clawed for tactics, for something, anything, but the truth pressed down heavier than the silence. This was not a battle I could win. This was endurance. And the question was no longer whether I would survive the night. It was how long I could resist before I became just another voice in the hum. The cold gnawed through every layer of clothing, burrowing into my bones. My breath rattled loud in the silence, each exhale a flare for whatever swam beneath me. I'd been awake too long, body running on fumes, nerves stretched thin until every flicker of shadow made me flinch. I tried to keep moving, circling the clearing with rifle raised, but fatigue slowed me. My knees buckled, vision swam, and for a moment the snow beneath me looked warm, inviting. I dropped hard, the impact jarring my teeth. The hum was constant now. Not the 3-beat rhythm, but a continuous drone, low and endless, pressing against my skull. It felt like it had replaced the sound of my heartbeat. I pressed a hand to my chest, half afraid I'd feel nothing there. The snow shifted in front of me, bulging upward like something immense was rising to the surface. I leveled the rifle, hands trembling, finger curling on the trigger, then stopped. The snow parted, and I saw her, my mother, standing in the clearing, hair silver, face soft with the same smile I'd carried in memory for years. She raised her arms, and though her lips didn't move, the voice filled me. "Stay, Alexander." I squeezed my eyes shut, growling through clenched teeth. Not her, not real. But when I opened them, she was closer, her eyes wet with tears. Behind her, others stood, my unit, whole and alive, grinning with the firelight of comradeship. They beckoned, voices overlapping, warm, familiar. "Stay with us. You've fought enough." The rifle sagged in my grip. My breath hitched. The weight of years of blood, of silence, pressed down until I thought my knees would give way. A soldier doesn't cry in the field, but in that moment, I nearly did. Then I felt the burn in my hands, the blisters from the stove, the scars from gripping hot iron. Pain. Real. Mine. I snarled, forced the rifle up, and fired into the vision. The figures dissolved like mist, scattering into snowflakes that spiraled away on the hum. The ground beneath roared, shaking the clearing, trees groaning like bones under strain. The illusion shattered, but it had cost me. My strength was gone. I collapsed to one knee, rifle clattering beside me, breath shallow and ragged. The snow split open ahead, wide this time, a jagged wound glowing with that pale, pulsing light. Heatless, endless. A doorway not in frost, but in earth itself. I stared into it, vision tunneling. The hum surged, filling every part of me, until my own thoughts drowned in it. My body leaned forward, weight shifting toward the abyss. Part of me wanted to fall, to stop fighting, to let the valley have me. But another part, small, stubborn, scarred from war and loss, refused. With the last of my strength, I grabbed the pack and tore free a flare. My thumb scraped the cap, sparks igniting red fire that hissed into the night. I hurled it into the fissure. The valley screamed. A sound so immense it shattered the silence, sent avalanches rolling from the peaks. The light in the fissure flared, then collapsed, snow rushing in to seal the wound. The hum stopped. I lay on my back in the snow, staring at the sky until stars blurred into one endless smear. My body shook with cold exhaustion and something deeper, a fear that didn't leave when the sound died. Because even as silence returned, I knew. The flare hadn't killed it. It had only bought me time. Somewhere beneath, it still listened, still waited. And if it had learned my frequency, then part of me was already its. The stars wheeled above, bright and merciless. I closed my eyes against them, listening to the silence, knowing it wasn't silence at all, knowing that one day the hum would start again. And when it did, I might not be strong enough to resist. I am Kasper Novak, age 34, a reconnaissance specialist with the Romanian Special Forces. Years in operations have taught me one immutable truth. Instinct matters more than protocol when the world gets quiet, and silence here is its own warning. I'm not a man who gets rattled easily, but these mountains, something about them presses on the mind, even before you see the danger. I arrived at the Carpathians under a low sun that seemed to linger, refusing to dip behind the forested peaks. Mist clung stubbornly to the valleys, curling through the trees like slow-moving smoke. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like iron dust carried by the wind. My boots sank slightly with every step into the loamy soil, and the echo of my movements was swallowed by the thick tangle of moss-covered branches and ancient oaks. My mission was simple on paper: investigate the disappearances of hikers in the region over the last year. Local accounts were sketchy. Some spoke of shadows that whisper, others of sudden cold gusts and footprints that vanished mid-trail. As a professional, I treat superstition as irrelevant, but I keep my senses sharp. Out here, the terrain alone is capable of killing a careless man. By late afternoon, I had reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. From here, the forest seemed endless, a rolling sea of dark green and black. I paused to check my gear, rations, water, radio, first aid, and noticed something odd. There were no birds, not a single crow, not a songbird, nothing. The only sound was the faint crackle of leaves under my boots and the distant, irregular drip of melting snow. I dropped my pack and scanned the terrain. That's when I saw it, a series of footprints, partially submerged in the moss, not human. Two long, elongated toes, slightly splayed, with claw marks at the tips. The prints twisted unnaturally around tree roots as though whoever or whatever made them was deliberately avoiding direct paths. I crouched, examining the impressions. A chill ran down my spine despite the exertion of hiking. My mind, trained to parse threats, instantly cataloged possibilities. Wild animals, maybe. But nothing in these mountains walks like this. The first real unease crept in, not from what I saw, but what I didn't hear. No wind stirring the higher branches, no rustle in the undergrowth. Normally, even the smallest critters make a sound. Here, silence hung like a warning. I tightened my jacket and moved forward slowly, scanning the ridgeline for vantage points. Night fell quickly, faster than the sun's descent suggested. The mist thickened, curling around trunks, hiding the valley floor in a ghostly gray. My tactical flashlight cut a weak swath of light through the fog, illuminating twisted roots and the occasional flash of mossy green. That's when I first heard it, a low, deliberate tap, like a branch snapping under a boot, but with no visible source. My head snapped toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing. I froze, heart rate rising despite my training. Tap, 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 not in a rhythm of a hiker, not random. Intelligent movement. My mind raced through all possibilities: bear, wolf, local prankster, but none fit the pattern. My fingers flexed around my knife handle. Suddenly, from the corner of my vision, something moved. Not fast, not even fully visible, just a blur of dark, shifting form, almost merging with the shadows. I swung the flashlight, but it was gone. A cold wind brushed past me, carrying a faint metallic odor, the same scent that had lingered earlier, more intense now. I retreated a few steps to higher ground, heart hammering but mind focused. Training took over. Observation first. The creature, if that's what it is, was watching me. I could feel it. The instinct was like a sixth sense, a pressure against my awareness. My pulse slowed as I reminded myself, don't panic. Evaluate. Survive. I set up a temporary bivouac on the ridge, close to a cluster of rocks that offered partial cover. The night pressed in, heavier than the mountain darkness should be. My ears strained against the silence for the slightest anomaly. Then came the whisper, a faint hissing, like words on the edge of perception, but not language. Tap, tap, rustle, close, then far. I could not pinpoint it. Sleep was impossible. My body demanded rest, but my mind refused. Every shadow became a threat, every gust of wind a warning. I ate minimally, rationing my energy, keeping the knife close and radio on, though transmission here was patchy. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed fluid in the fog. Then, unmistakably, I saw eyes. two dim, yellow orbs reflecting my flashlight from the ridge across the valley. They vanished when I blinked, but I know what I saw. Something was watching me, intelligent and patient. By dawn, I had one option: move. Staying meant the predator would eventually test me. I packed quickly, leaving no trace, moving along the ridgeline toward a steeper descent. Every step measured, silent, every muscle tensed. The prints appeared again, twisted and warped as though the thing knew I was following, anticipating my path. I felt hunted, and hunted intelligently. By midday, I reached a narrow gorge. Fog swirled here like liquid smoke. The air was colder, sharper, and carried the faint scent of decay, like an animal long dead. I paused, listening. A soft, deliberate click echoed off the rock walls, then silence. I realized then that the thing was mimicking sounds to mislead me. A predator with strategy, not instinct. And in that realization, I understood. The Carpathians hide more than wilderness. They hide intelligence older than I could comprehend, patient and cunning. My training could prepare me for combat, for human or animal threat. But this was something else. I pushed onward, aware of every shadow, every sound, every movement. My objective had changed, not just reconnaissance. Now it was survival. And as I descended, I could not shake the feeling that I had entered its territory, and that it was not just hunting, but studying me. The gorge was narrower than I anticipated, the walls steep and slick with moss. Every step required careful placement, boots pressing into wet stone, muscles straining against gravity. The fog didn't lift, it thickened, curling around me like a living thing, muffling sounds and twisting shadows. The creature, or whatever it was here somewhere, moving silently in the gray. I could feel it watching, calculating. I stopped to catch my breath, crouched behind a jutting rock, and scanned the area. The footprints appeared again, skirting around pools of water as though obeying some instinct I couldn't parse. They were fresh, impressions of elongated toes clawed into the soft earth, turning sharply with unnatural precision. I traced them with my eyes, then realized they weren't going anywhere. They led in circles. The thing wasn't fleeing or hunting blindly, it was drawing me in. I swallowed hard. My training screamed ambush, and yet curiosity, professional instinct pushed me forward. I adjusted my grip on my knife, checked my sidearm, and crept along the gorge. Every rustle of moss underfoot felt like a shout. A branch snapped somewhere above me, sharp and deliberate. I froze, breath shallow. My heart thumped against my ribs like a warning drum. Then I heard it, a faint mimic of my own movements, echoing mine but slightly delayed, like a distorted reflection of sound. My mind raced. No ordinary predator mimics its prey. That meant intelligence, strategy. Whoever or whatever was out here could anticipate my reactions, set traps, lead me where it wanted. The first confrontation came subtly. I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that wasn't cast by the sun, the fog, or any rock. The fog shifted as if alive. My knife flashed as I swung toward it, but there was nothing. Just the lingering scent of iron and wet fur, or flesh, something inhuman. I didn't panic, not outwardly, but adrenaline sharpened every sense. I slowed my movements, becoming deliberate, silent, letting instinct and training guide me. I remembered my mentors. The predator is always patient. Don't give it the first advantage. Hours passed, though the light barely changed in the fog. Then I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature emerged from a cluster of shadows, tall, impossibly lean, skin mottled dark gray and brown, camouflaging perfectly with the forested rocks. Its eyes were yellow, reflective like a cat's, intelligent, calculating. It didn't run or attack. It observed. Every step I took, it mirrored subtly, staying just out of striking distance. I realized then the full horror. It wasn't hunting for food. It was testing me, measuring my reactions, learning my tactics. Every survival instinct I had trained for was under scrutiny. I paused behind a rock overhang, chest tight, mind racing. I needed a plan. Traps would be useless. The creature was too clever, too adaptive. I had to rely on improvisation. My hand brushed against my pack. I pulled out a flare. Not to shoot, not to signal, but to create an unpredictable stimulus, force it to react. I ignited the flare and tossed it toward a narrow corridor between two boulders. The creature flinched, recoiled slightly, then paused. Its attention was fixed, calculating, yet it didn't flee. I took advantage of that moment, moving quietly along a side path that had not occupied. Then I made my first critical mistake. Thinking I could outmaneuver it, I descended into a shallow ravine, fog thickening like cement. My foot slipped, and I hit the ground with a sharp crack. The sound echoed off the walls. My heart lurched. Silence followed, then a soft clicking, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I had ever encountered. I looked up. There it was, crouched on a ledge above me, impossibly still, limbs folded inhumanly, eyes locked on mine. It tilted its head as though considering my worth. My skin prickled. Instinct screamed to run. But I knew that in this terrain, fleeing would be fatal. Instead, I improvised. I ripped a small mirror from my pack, field equipment for signaling, and angled it toward the creature. The reflection caught its eyes. It recoiled, startled for a split second. I seized the moment, climbing the ravine wall with careful, deliberate movements. Every scrape of stone under my boots was amplified in my own ears, but the creature hesitated. Once at the top, I paused behind a rock, barely daring to breathe. The mirror worked only temporarily. When I glanced back, it had vanished, as if absorbed into the fog itself. No tracks, no movement, just the lingering metallic scent and the oppressive feeling of being observed. I realized then that my assumptions were dangerous. This wasn't a creature you could fight with weapons, traps, or cunning alone. It was strategic, adaptive, and terrifyingly patient. I couldn't outsmart it. I could only survive, evade, and hope to escape. Night fell again, heavier and colder than before. The fog thickened into a near-solid wall. My hands were numb, body trembling despite layered clothing. The soundscape of the forest had changed. Every creak, every drip of water sounded deliberate, like footsteps echoing a rhythm I couldn't predict. I wasn't walking alone. I had never been alone, but the thing had made sure I understood that fact. Then I heard the whispering again. Clearer now, more insistent, almost human but wrong, like a language I should know but couldn't comprehend. Words hovered on the edge of hearing, teasing, promising. My skin crawled, mind straining. I forced myself to focus on breathing, on movement, on staying alive. I kept climbing along the ridge, avoiding the valley floor where the fog pooled like a living trap. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart jump. Every shadow in the moonlight made me flinch. And then I saw another set of prints, older than the ones I had been following. They led parallel to mine, as though someone or something had been tracking me for days. Panic threatened, but I shoved it down. I couldn't afford fear, only calculation. My plan: move toward higher ground where visibility might give me an advantage. The creature would follow eventually. I had to create an opening, some chance to break the cycle. By early morning, exhausted and bleeding from minor scrapes, I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a frozen creek. The fog thinned slightly. I scanned the surroundings. Nothing. Silence. Relief was brief. Then a shadow flickered across the ridge opposite mine. A figure, tall, elongated, moving with impossible grace, paused, stared, then vanished. I realized this place had no rules, no predictability. I had survived so far by improvisation, by patience, by trust and instinct. But that was temporary. The creature had learned from me, adapted, and now it would be waiting. Always waiting. I forced myself to rest briefly, wrapped in my jacket, knife at my side, every sense strained for the slightest hint of movement. And as I drifted in exhaustion, I felt it, the subtle pressure of awareness, the undeniable sense that I was studied, observed, hunted, yet not just for food. For something else, something older, smarter. And I knew even if I survived the night, I would never truly leave this place. The mountains had claimed me. Not yet, but the mark was made. The predator was patient. I had only delayed the inevitable confrontation. By the time the sun barely pierced the thick fog, I had been awake for more than 36 hours. My body ached with fatigue, muscles trembling from the constant strain of climbing, crouching, and listening. Every step felt like moving through a dream or a nightmare. The Carpathians had become a living entity, each tree and rock a conspirator, each shadow a potential predator. I was following a narrow ridge now, higher than anything I had traversed before. The fog rolled along the cliffs below like molten gray waves, swallowing valleys and gullies. The air was sharp, each breath stinging my lungs, carrying the same metallic scent that had followed me since the first night. I knew it was near. I could feel it. Then I heard it, a faint rustle, like a leaf brushing against stone behind me. I froze. My pulse surged, but training took over, slow, deliberate breathing, eyes scanning the environment, every sense on high alert. The shadow emerged from the fog, not running, not attacking, just moving deliberately toward me, keeping its distance, studying me. I realized this was no ordinary predator. This thing wasn't just hunting, it was communicating through fear, shaping my movements, forcing me into terrain it favored. I couldn't fight it in the conventional sense. I had to outthink it, even if only temporarily. I scanned the ridge for any advantage. A narrow overhang appeared a few meters ahead, rocks jagged and steep. If I could reach it, I might gain a better vantage and force the creature to reveal itself. I moved carefully, boots finding purchase on slick stone. The fog thickened, visibility dropping to mere meters. Then I heard the whisper again, faint, sibilant, almost intelligible, echoing off the cliffs. I tightened my grip on my knife. This close, I had to rely entirely on instinct. The creature mimicked my breathing, subtle but deliberate, a sound I couldn't ignore. My skin prickled as I climbed faster, heart hammering, senses screaming. Suddenly, it lunged, or at least, I thought it lunged. A blur of gray and brown sprang from the fog, moving faster than any human, faster than any animal I had ever encountered. I dove to the side, knife swinging instinctively. It missed, colliding with the rock, a low growl vibrating through the fog. I scrambled, adrenaline surging. The creature didn't chase immediately. It paused, watching as if calculating my next move. I understood then, this wasn't a fight I could win with strength. Only speed, improvisation, and luck. Spotting a jagged fissure in the rocks ahead, I made a desperate decision. I threw a small flare into the fog below, igniting it with a sharp hiss. The light cut through the gray, reflecting in the creature's eyes. It hesitated, just enough. I leapt toward the fissure, clambering down jagged stone, hands scraping against sharp edges. Pain shot through my palms, but I ignored it. Every second counted. The creature followed, but cautiously. Each movement it made was deliberate, intelligent, aware of the terrain. It could climb, but the fissure slowed it. My lungs burned, legs trembling, but I pressed on, forcing myself lower, closer to the creek I had scouted the previous day. Survival instinct drove me more than fear now. Exhaustion sharpened my focus. I reached the creek, water partially frozen, the surface slick. Using the ice as camouflage, I slipped into a narrow channel along the creek bed, forcing the creature to adjust. It didn't follow directly. I could sense its frustration, a predator challenged by ingenuity. Hours seemed to pass, though I had no way to tell. The fog remained, thick and oppressive, hiding everything except the faint, shifting shadows that reminded me I was still being observed. Then I saw something that froze my blood. Another set of eyes, low to the ground, reflecting in the water, but not the same ones as before. Smaller, more numerous. The creature wasn't alone. I realized with a chilling clarity I had stumbled into territory, and it was not just inhabited by one predator, but possibly a pack, or something far more complex than any pack. My heart pounded. Every step forward carried risk. Every movement could betray me. I forced myself to move, low and silent. My body screamed. My mind teetered between exhaustion and hyper-awareness. The creatures didn't attack immediately. They seemed curious, testing boundaries, observing. I caught glimpses, elongated limbs, mottled skin, eyes reflective and intelligent. Not mindless, not animalistic, but deliberate, patient, calculating. Then I heard the whispering again, closer now, almost directly in my ear. I spun around, knife raised, but there was nothing, just fog and the faint metallic scent. My instincts screamed, "Don't stop, don't hesitate, don't look back." I climbed another ridge leading to a narrow pass I had spotted from above. If I could reach the other side, maybe, just maybe, I could leave the immediate hunting ground. My legs trembled violently, arms shaking from the climb. My grip on the knife was raw, my palms bleeding, but I moved, always forward. And then, just as I reached the ridge, I saw it clearly. One figure, taller than the others, standing at the fog's edge, perfectly still, watching me. Its eyes glowed yellow in the weak light, unblinking, assessing. And then, as I watched, it tilted its head in a way that was almost human, as if acknowledging me, understanding me, anticipating my next move. I froze for a heartbeat, too long, and it let out a low, guttural hiss, a sound that was neither animal nor human, resonating through my bones. Then it disappeared, melting back into the fog. The other figures followed, vanishing like smoke. I didn't stop. I ran, fueled by sheer adrenaline and the primal need to survive, scrambling over jagged rocks, through mist and undergrowth, until finally the terrain leveled and the forest thinned enough to reveal the faint outline of a dirt road. Exhausted, bleeding, and shaking, I collapsed on the edge, gasping for breath. I was alive, for now. But as I looked back into the misty Carpathians, I knew the truth. The predators hadn't gone. They were still there, observing, waiting, patient. Every instinct in my body told me that leaving the ridge was only temporary relief. These mountains didn't release their prey. They tested them, studied them, marked them. Even now, sitting by the roadside, the metallic scent still lingers faintly in my nose. My mind keeps replaying their eyes, the whispering, the deliberate intelligence. I cannot unsee what I saw. I cannot unhear what I heard. The Carpathians claimed many before me. Some never left. Others returned, changed. I survived this encounter, but I did not conquer it. Whatever these creatures are, they are patient, intelligent, and ancient. And they are still here, in the fog, waiting. I don't know if I will ever return. And perhaps that is for the best. Because deep down, I know that the mountains are not just wild. They are alive with something older, smarter, and far more dangerous than any human mind can comprehend. And for now, that knowledge alone is enough to haunt me. My name is Dr. Elias Moretti, volcanologist, 41 years old, originally from Naples, though I've spent most of my adult life chasing fire across continents. I am not a reckless man by nature. I prefer data sets, stable measurements, and quiet analysis, but something about volatile landscapes has always tugged at me. I tell myself it's the science, the pursuit of truth. Deep down, I know it's an obsession. That obsession brought me to the Aniakchak caldera in Alaska, one of the most remote and inhospitable volcanic sites in the world. Few scientists ever bothered to stay here through the winter. The helicopter pilots who dropped me off joked that I'd be the only Italian living in hell's freezer. They weren't wrong. My assignment was to install seismic instruments and remain for 3 weeks to record tremors beneath the crater. A strange rhythmic activity had been detected from orbiting satellites, something neither tectonic nor meteorological. I volunteered before the grant was even finalized. The air here has a taste, sharp, metallic, with a faint sulfurous undertone that burns the nose. Even at noon, the light comes thin and watery through the cloud bank, making the snow look less like purity and more like ash disguised in white. My boots crunch over layers of frozen pumice, each step sounding brittle like walking on broken glass. The wind slices at my face and roars through the jagged rim, carrying with it an echo that doesn't always match the gust that created it. On my first night, as I set up inside the prefabricated monitoring station, a squat metal container anchored with cables, I swore I heard someone calling from the ridge. A single syllable, stretched and distorted by the wind. Eli, as. I froze, holding my breath, every instinct screaming that no one else should be within 50 miles. I opened the door, letting in a blade of freezing air, and stared into the caldera. Nothing moved. Only darkness pooled at the edges of the ice field below. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks through the crater walls. Still, the sound clung to me long after I lay down on the cot. My pulse matched the rhythm of the tremors I'd come to measure. Over the next 2 days, I immersed myself in my work, setting the seismographs, calibrating the GPS units, drilling into the permafrost. My hands stung from cold despite my gloves, and more than once I thought about the warmth of Naples, the glow of street lamps on wet cobblestones. But whenever fatigue dragged at me, I remembered why I was here, to catch something no one else had seen. Data from this site had been anomalous for months, tremors rising and falling like a heartbeat. The heartbeat grew stronger at night. Lying in the cot, wrapped in 2 sleeping bags, I'd feel it. A low vibration through the ground, not quite enough to rattle the instruments, but strong enough to hum in my teeth. The hum was not constant, it pulsed like inhaling and exhaling. I'd wake at odd hours, sweating despite the cold, convinced someone had whispered through the thin walls of the station. On the 3rd night, I ventured out with my headlamp. The beam cut through swirling snow, illuminating jagged black rock. My breath turned to mist that drifted away too quickly, as if pulled. When I turned toward the fissure I'd marked earlier, the light seemed swallowed by darkness. I crouched there, letting my gloved hand rest on the frozen crust. The hum vibrated faintly through my palm, and underneath it, a suggestion of rhythm, almost like words. More Eddie. I jerked my hand away. My heart banged so hard in my chest it drowned out the wind. For a moment, I nearly bolted back to the station. Instead, some foolish mixture of pride and curiosity held me in place. I forced myself to whisper into the night, "Who's there?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to die. Then the fissure exhaled. A warm draft slid over my face, smelling of damp stone and something older, something that should have stayed buried. I stumbled back, breath fogging violently in the cold, until the station loomed behind me like a lifeline. I slammed the door and leaned against it, listening to my own ragged gasps. The instruments ticked quietly in the background, but when I checked them, none had recorded anything unusual. That detail terrified me more than if they had, because whatever was speaking beneath the ice did not want to be measured. The next morning, the world looked deceptively calm. Blue sky stretched over the crater, and for a brief hour the sun spilled light like molten gold on the rim. I forced myself outside, setting new stakes and downloading seismic readings. But even in that brightness, I felt watched. Every shadow cast by the jagged rim seemed a fraction too long, as though something invisible stretched it toward me. My training told me to rely on evidence, not paranoia. Still, when the wind shifted, I thought I heard voices threading through it. Not English, not Italian, something guttural, layered, the way multiple rocks grinding together almost form syllables. I wanted to radio base camp, to demand an early extraction, but my pride silenced me. I had begged for this assignment. If I fled after 3 nights of unease, I would never be trusted again. And some deeper, darker part of me whispered, "You don't want to leave yet. You want to know what it is." That night, the heartbeat was stronger. My cot shook lightly like a hand nudging it from below. I lay frozen, ears straining. The pulse matched my breathing until it began to lead it, drawing my lungs into rhythm. And then, soft, almost tender, came the whisper again. "Eli. Az." This time it wasn't from outside. It came from beneath the floor. I didn't sleep after that. I lay on the cot, rigid as stone, staring at the ceiling of the metal container, counting my heartbeats to anchor myself against the impossible rhythm rising from beneath me. When dawn finally bled gray through the slit window, I swung my legs down and pressed my bare feet to the cold floor. Nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that mocks you for being afraid of it. Coffee tasted like ash that morning. I logged my routine entries, seismic activity stable, no significant anomalies, and wrote in the margin, almost as a confession. Personal perception of auditory distortion continues. My handwriting looked shaky, alien. By midday, the wind picked up again, slicing across the rim and rattling the cables that tethered the station. I forced myself into the harness and descended the short path to my instruments. The seismographs stood like faithful companions in the snow, their needles scratching steady lines. Yet when I touched the ground, the faint hum was there, undeniable. I crouched, closing my eyes. It wasn't just vibration, it was cadence, a pattern like syllables, spoken too deep for air but too structured for geology. The rational part of me fought back, resonance from ice fractures, venting gases, nothing else. But another part, an instinct older than science, told me I was listening to something alive. That night, the voice returned with intent. I had just doused the lantern and crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard it, soft as cloth tearing. Moretti? I shot upright, clutching the flashlight, beam darting around the cabin. Nothing. My breath fogged the air. I sat frozen, waiting. Then it came again, perfectly mimicking the tone I'd used on the ridge days before. Who's there? My stomach turned to ice. That was my voice, my words, echoed back to me with a delay of 3 nights. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just listened as the floor hummed and the fissure below seemed to breathe. I thought of myths, sirens, oracles, creatures that lure men with stolen voices. I thought of seismic activity that had no correlation with tectonics. I thought of the simple truth. I was utterly alone, and something beneath me knew my name. Hours must have passed with me sitting there, paralyzed, until exhaustion finally blotted out terror. When I woke, the door to the station was open. Snow had blown across the threshold, a thin drift leading inside. My boots, muddy from the day before, were no longer by the cot. They sat neatly outside, half buried, laces tied together as if someone had set them out for me. I told myself I must have done it in a daze, but the neatness of it chilled me. My habits were messy. I never tied my boots together. The fissure yawned below the ridge when I hiked down to check the instruments again. Something about the darkness inside it looked deeper than shadow. I tossed a rock. It should have clattered for seconds before fading. Instead, the sound stopped immediately, like it had been swallowed. And then, faint but clear, my own laugh echoed back. My throat went dry. That laugh had come from me 2 nights earlier, when I'd spilled powdered milk on my notebook and cursed at myself. It wasn't echo. It was memory. The fissure remembered. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own snowshoes, and fled up the ridge. The wind followed me, carrying scraps of voices that weren't voices. Scientific reports, muttered prayers, my mother calling my name when I was a child. All mine. All wrong. That night I tried not to sleep, but exhaustion clawed me down. Dreams came vivid, blistering. I stood at the edge of Naples Harbor, but the water wasn't water. It was black stone heaving like lungs, and from beneath it, thousands of mouths whispered my name. I woke screaming, my throat raw. The instruments ticked on, blind to what was happening. I couldn't radio base camp. The signal had gone dead sometime in the night, static hissing where voices should have been. My rational mind began to fracture. Every scrape of cable, every gust through the caldera I heard as language. The thing beneath the ice wasn't just calling me anymore. It was answering me, testing me. That evening, I tried an experiment. I knelt by the fissure with my recorder and asked out loud, "What are you?" The ground thrummed, the air warmed, and after a long silence, a whisper surfaced, cracked and clumsy but unmistakable. "What are you?" My blood went cold. It hadn't only mimicked, it had learned. When I staggered back from the fissure, the recorder still humming in my frozen hand, I felt the air pressing against me, not just cold, but heavy, like a weight trying to shove me into the earth. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs locked. The words it had spoken, broken, distorted, but undeniably shaped, still echoed in my skull. What are you? The question cut deeper than fear. It wasn't just repetition anymore. It was curiosity. I forced myself up the ridge, boots grinding in the snow, and slammed the station door shut behind me. I didn't even take off my gloves, just collapsed into the cot, recorder clutched to my chest. The silence inside was suffocating, and yet I swore I heard faint scratches beneath the floor, as though something traced my movements from below. By morning, I convinced myself to play the tape. My thumb hovered over the button for long minutes, trembling. When the voice emerged from the tiny speaker, I nearly dropped it. At first, it was just wind distortion, but then the cadence sharpened. What are you? Clear enough that no machine could be blamed. Clear enough that my training, years of explaining away myth with geology, crumbled. I rewound it a dozen times, hoping the words would dissolve back into noise. They didn't. Sleep became impossible. My eyes burned from staring too long at every corner of the cabin. Shadows stretched unnaturally, shifting even when my lamp was still. The hum beneath the floor grew constant, vibrating in time with my heartbeat. By the fourth day, I realized I was pacing the station, muttering responses aloud as if in dialogue. I'm Elias Moretti. I'm a scientist. I study you. Each word left my throat cracked and raw, but I couldn't stop. The air seemed to lean closer every time I spoke, as if listening. That night, the mimicry sharpened again. As I tried to choke down freeze-dried rations, I heard a faint crunch outside, my own footsteps, exactly the rhythm I made when circling the cabin. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. Then came the voice. Not from below this time, from just beyond the metal walls. I'm Elias Moretti. It was my voice, my tone, but stretched wrong. Panic tore through me. I bolted to the door, pressing my ear against it. Outside, snow hissed in the wind, but beneath it I heard more sounds. My laugh, my cough, the way I cleared my throat before recording a note. All of it replayed, overlapping, circling the station. I stayed awake until dawn, hands locked around the flare gun. When light finally seeped over the rim, I stepped outside, every muscle taut. There were footprints in the snow. At first, I thought they were mine. But no. They circled the cabin in perfect symmetry, each stride identical, each impression too exact, like a stamp pressed into the snow again and again. Human, but wrong. I followed them a short way down the ridge before stopping. They led straight toward the fissure. Of course they did. The air down there shimmered with heat despite the cold. My breath fogged upward, but the mist from the fissure sank, dragging low like smoke. The hole seemed larger than before, jagged edges widening. I crouched at the rim, trembling, and whispered into the darkness, "Why are you calling me?" The silence stretched. Then, soft as breath on glass, came the reply. Calling. Me. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. It was still testing, still mimicking, but every word grew cleaner, closer. When I stumbled back to the station, my thoughts twisted. If it was learning, then every word I gave it was a weapon. Every sound, every gesture, it stole. And yet, part of me wanted to keep teaching it, to see how far it could go. That was the danger of obsession. Even when you knew the fire would burn you, you still reached toward the flame. That night, I dreamt again. I stood inside the fissure, the walls closing around me, black stone pulsing like muscle. Voices poured from the rock, not just mine anymore, but dozens of others. Men, women, children, some sobbing, some laughing, some screaming, and threaded through them all was my own name, spoken in infinite variations. I woke with my fists bleeding where I'd clenched them against my teeth. The cot shook beneath me. The hum had become a roar, and then I heard it, inside my head, not through my ears. Elias, come down. It wasn't mimicry anymore. It was command. I slammed my palms against my ears, but the words still rippled through me. They weren't vibrations anymore. They were thoughts pushed into my skull, layered over my own inner voice until I couldn't tell where I ended and the other began. I staggered to the recorder, turned it on, and whispered furiously into the mic. This is Dr. Elias Moretti. Aniakchak Caldera, Day 6. Phenomenon is escalating. I am experiencing auditory hallucinations. No, not hallucinations. They are structured, responsive, commanding. My voice cracked, and I forced it steady. If anyone finds this, I didn't imagine it. The recorder felt useless in my hand. Proof meant nothing if I was swallowed before I could deliver it. That morning I found the footprints again. More of them. Not just circling the cabin, but trailing off toward the fissure in winding spirals. Some prints smaller, others larger, none my size. And yet, every single one was pressed in my exact tread pattern. Identical sole, identical scuff on the left heel. Hundreds of replicas of me pacing the rim in silence. The air around the fissure pulsed hotter, smelling of rust and wet stone. I swore I could see motion beneath the surface, like something vast shifting, brushing against the crust of the earth. I tried to resist. I barricaded the cabin door with the cot, shoved instruments against it, even tied myself to the frame with climbing rope. But each night, The command deepened. Elias, come down. Not shouted, not angry. Gentle, patient. The way you coax a child closer to the water's edge. The dreams worsened. I dreamt of my colleagues back in Naples, their mouths open but my voice pouring out. I dreamt of my father's face, but his eyes were black fissures, and when he called my name, it was in the same warped tone. I woke drenched in sweat, throat raw from speaking in my sleep. By the 9th day, the station itself betrayed me. Instruments began to record sounds I hadn't heard, low resonant tones, frequencies too regular to be natural. On one graph, the peaks formed letters. My name. I smashed the printout against the wall, screaming. Paper scattered, black ink like wounds across white snow. The fissure answered with laughter. My laughter. That night, I couldn't fight the pull anymore. The rope cut into my wrists as I tore free, stumbling barefoot into the snow, eyes fixed on the darkness below. The fissure glowed faintly, a sickly amber light pulsing from deep inside, timed with the heartbeat I'd felt since arriving. I crept closer, the heat rising, thawing frost from my hair. My skin prickled, sweat rolling despite the freezing air. The whispers grew louder, layered voices, children, elders, men, women, all speaking in my cadence. Elias, come, come. When I reached the edge, I saw movement inside. Not one shape, but many. Faces half-formed, eyes too wide, mouths stretching open in grotesque mimicry. They were mine, and not mine. Every expression I'd ever worn, twisted in stone and ash, all staring upward. My knees buckled. I nearly pitched forward. Some fragment of reason stopped me. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching the flare gun. With trembling hands, I aimed into the darkness and fired. The flare hissed down, trailing sparks, illuminating the fissure's walls in violent red. For an instant, I saw them clearly. Dozens of figures pressed into the rock like fossils, their mouths opening and closing in silent imitation. Their faces blurred, shifting into mine, then into strangers, then back again. The flare sputtered out, swallowed by blackness. The fissure exhaled. Hot air blasted upward, carrying with it a chorus of voices that made the metal of my station groan. I staggered away, blind with terror, until the door slammed behind me. Inside, I collapsed, shaking so hard I couldn't hold the flare gun anymore. And in the silence that followed, I heard my own voice whisper from beneath the floor, tender and triumphant, "You're almost ready." I tore the rope from my wrists and sat on the floor, back against the wall, breathing as if I had run for miles. The whisper still pulsed in my skull. "You're almost ready." Almost ready for what? To give myself up? To step willingly into that heat and shadow? I pressed my palms against my face until I saw sparks behind my eyelids. My rational mind clawed at an explanation. Subterranean resonance, auditory pareidolia, isolation psychosis. But the scientist in me was losing ground to the man who had heard his own voice teaching something alive how to speak. The cabin reeked of sulfur. I realized it wasn't the air outside. It was bleeding up through the floor, seeping into my clothes, my skin, into me. No matter how tightly I shut the vents, the smell persisted. I felt contaminated. I considered burning the station down. One flare to the wall and I'd erase every trace of this place. But the thought came with a sting of dread. What if the fissure didn't need walls to call me? What if the fire only freed it to spread further? I forced myself to think like a volcanologist, like a scientist. What would I do if this were simply unstable geology? Observe, collect data, approach with caution. And so I prepared. I set a fresh recorder, checked my spare batteries, and strapped on the harness I'd once used for sample collection. I loaded the flare gun and clipped my last 3 flares to my belt. My boots trembled as I laced them. I wasn't preparing for science anymore. I was preparing for war or for burial. The hours stretched long, each tick of the instruments amplified by silence. Outside, the wind had died completely. The world felt held in a breath, waiting for me to move. When I finally stepped outside, the air was strangely warm. No gust, no bite of ice, just stillness. Snow crunched underfoot, each step deliberate, leading me down the path toward the fissure. The footprints were still there, dozens of them spiraling inward like a trap. At the edge, I clipped the rope to a rock anchor. My headlamp beam sliced into the dark, illuminating jagged stone slick with condensation. Heat radiated upward, moist and suffocating. And then the voice spoke again, not faint this time, not buried. It came clear, resonant, vibrating through stone and marrow alike. Elias, come down. It was no longer mimicry. It was command, smooth as human speech, and worse, it carried my own tone of weary defiance. My knees shook, but I forced myself closer, lowering one boot into the fissure, the rope taut in my hands. The heat licked at me, clinging like wet cloth. My skin prickled. Shapes moved in the shadows, not bodies, not exactly, but outlines of faces, torsos, fingers pressed into the walls. They swam in the stone as if the rock itself was soft, pliable, and every face turned as one toward me. I fired a flare. Red light burst, flooding the chamber below. The figures recoiled, shifting and twisting, mouths opening in silent screams that weren't silent at all. My recorder captured the sound, hundreds of overlapping voices, most of them mine. Some I didn't recognize at all. The flare sputtered, casting sparks over the walls. I saw inscriptions etched into the rock, spirals and symbols, so faint they seemed burned by time itself. They writhed in the light, forming shapes that made my vision blur. Then the voices surged again, drowning my thoughts. We are you. You are us. Come down. Come home. I clutched the rope until the fibers cut into my gloves. Sweat poured down my back, steam rising from my coat. My heart hammered like a drum trying to break free from my chest. I wanted to scream that I wasn't theirs, that I wasn't ready, but my throat betrayed me. The words clawed upward, spilling from my mouth without permission. I am coming. The sound wasn't mine alone. It was harmonized, layered with echoes from beneath, as though 100 versions of me spoke in unison. I scrambled back, hauling myself up the rope, stumbling onto the rim. My legs buckled, and I collapsed in the snow, chest heaving. The fissure pulsed below, glowing faint amber with each heartbeat. Back in the cabin, I collapsed against the door, trembling. My recorder still blinked red. Proof. Evidence. But what good was evidence when the thing beneath me wasn't finished? As sleep clawed at me, the whisper returned, gentle as a lullaby. You're ready now. I woke with frost on my eyelashes and the recorder still blinking in my hand. My mouth tasted of iron, like I had bitten my tongue all night. I pushed myself upright, every muscle aching, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the hum under the floor was real or imagined. It vibrated through my spine, low and patient, as if it knew I had no strength left to resist. I tried to eat. The ration bar crumbled like chalk in my mouth. Water tasted brackish, faintly metallic. I spat it out. My body was rejecting nourishment as though it had chosen another source. The fissure was feeding me something else, something I couldn't name. The sun didn't rise that day, or if it did, it never breached the rim. The crater remained steeped in perpetual twilight, the snow dull and gray. I stepped outside, rope clipped to my harness again, but not to descend, just to breathe. My breath plumed in front of me, but the air was hot enough to sting. It smelled like a forge, a place where things were broken down and reforged into shapes they were never meant to be. The footprints had multiplied overnight. They weren't just circling anymore. They marched outward from the fissure in every direction, weaving paths across the caldera floor. Some led straight to my cabin door, pausing there as though waiting for me to answer. I backed away, nearly slipping. My pulse thundered in my ears. If they could leave the fissure, then the station wasn't protection. Nothing was. Inside, I clawed at the radio until my fingers bled from turning the dial. Static, only static. Then, underneath it, my own voice again. Dr. Elias Moretti, Aniakchak Caldera, Day 6. The recording I'd made 2 days ago, bleeding through the frequency as though the fissure itself was transmitting me back to myself. I dropped the mic like it had burned me. By nightfall, the whispers became words, not only in my head, but aloud, vibrating through the thin walls. Elias, come home. Sometimes in my voice, sometimes in others. A woman, sobbing. A child, laughing. A chorus stitched together from lives that could not be here. I barricaded myself again, shoving the cot against the door, curling in the corner with the flare gun across my lap. My eyelids drooped, exhaustion dragging me under. That's when I dreamed of the harbor again. Naples. but wrong. The sea had solidified it into black rock, and people stood frozen knee-deep in it, their mouths wide. My colleagues, my father, strangers I had passed on the street, each face flickered between theirs and mine. They chanted softly, "You are us. We are you." When I woke, my body was drenched in sweat, steam rising off me in the freezing air. The barricade had been moved aside. The door stood open, snow drifting in, and at the threshold sat my boots, tied together neatly, waiting. The fissure glowed faintly in the distance. The heartbeat pulsed stronger, sinking with mine until I couldn't tell which belonged to me. I should have run. I should have begged for extraction, tried to hike the impossible miles back to civilization. But instead, I found myself strapping the recorder to my chest, checking the last flare in the gun. My hands shook, not from fear alone, but from anticipation. The voice slid through the darkness, smooth now, fluent. "Elias, come down. It is time." And God help me, I rose to my feet. The rope rasped against the anchor as I lowered myself into the fissure. My gloves were slick with sweat, even in the freezing air. The beam of my headlamp cut a narrow cone through the black, illuminating slick stone walls that glistened like wet skin. Heat pulsed upward with each step down, wrapping me, suffocating me. The voices came immediately, a tide rising to meet me. Not whispers anymore. Not fractured syllables. They spoke in unison, 100 tones braided together. "Welcome home, Elias." My gut clenched. I forced myself to keep descending, the recorder on my chest capturing everything, though I no longer believed anyone else would ever hear it. The rope shivered against the rock, echoing louder than it should have. My own breath sounded foreign, as if someone else exhaled through my lungs. 10 meters down, the fissure widened into a chamber. I swung my boots against the rock and dropped onto a ledge slick with condensation. My lamp swept across the walls and froze. Faces, dozens, maybe hundreds, pressed into the stone. Some only partial, an eye here, a mouth there, others almost whole, their features blurred but recognizable as human. They weren't carved. They were grown into the rock, as if the caldera had swallowed people and decided to remember them. My knees buckled. One face was mine. It stared back at me from the wall, lips slightly parted, eyes half closed, as if dreaming. I staggered forward, trembling hand reaching before I snatched it back. The stone pulsed faintly, warm as living flesh. The voices swelled, filling the chamber, some sharp, some gentle. They overlapped until meaning blurred, but one thread cut clear. "We are you. You are us." My mind fractured between terror and fascination. The scientist in me wanted to map the pattern, to catalog every detail. The man in me wanted to scream until my throat tore. I forced words out hoarse. What are you?" Silence fell. The air held still, thick as oil. Then from every mouth in the wall, my own voice answered, "We are what waits." The sound reverberated through my bones, rattling my teeth. My stomach lurched. I raised the flare gun with shaking hands and fired. The chamber ignited in crimson light. For a heartbeat, I saw everything. Faces shifting, merging, peeling away into new shapes. Some I recognized. A colleague from Naples, a pilot who dropped me here, my mother, all flickered across the stone before melting back into the blur. And through it all, my own face multiplied. Not one, but dozens, each with a different expression, fear, rage, sorrow, laughter, all staring at me. The flare hissed out, plunging me back into choking darkness. Then the wall exhaled. Hot, damp air blasted my face, carrying with it a stench of blood and ash. My lamp flickered, dimming, and in that dim light I saw the stone begin to move. Not just faces shifting, but entire bodies pushing forward, as if the wall itself were trying to give birth. Hands pressed out, fingers flexing, dripping black liquid that sizzled on the stone. Mouths opened and a chorus poured out, not mimicry anymore, but speech, fluent and unified. "Join us, Elias. You have always been here." My heart nearly tore itself apart. I scrambled for the rope, fumbling with the harness, but the heat pressed down heavier than gravity. My limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. My own voice echoed from the chamber, speaking words I hadn't said. "I am ready." "No," I screamed, raw, fighting the pressure crushing my chest. I clutched the rope, hauling myself upward inch by inch, every muscle screaming. Below me, the chamber roared, the voices rising in fury and grief. Faces stretched from the stone, mouths open in silent wails. The fissure pulsed brighter, an amber glow chasing me up the shaft. Heat seared the back of my neck, and with each pull I expected hands to seize my ankles. Somehow, I reached the rim. I collapsed on the snow, rolling away from the edge as the fissure exhaled one last time, a blast of heat that melted frost around me in a perfect circle. I lay there gasping, staring up at the blank gray sky. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the flare gun. My recorder still blinked on my chest, the red light steady. Proof, I thought dimly. But proof of what? That the mountain itself wanted me? That the earth had learned to speak? The wind rose again, sharp and cold, sweeping over the caldera. For a moment, the world felt normal. Just snow, rock, and silence. Then, carried on the gust, came my own voice, clear as day. You'll come back. I stumbled back into the station, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. My chest heaved as I slid to the floor, staring at the recorder still strapped to me. The red light blinked steadily, patient as a heartbeat. Proof. Evidence. Yet the longer I looked at it, the more I wondered if I'd only brought the fisher's voice closer to me, closer to the surface. The cabin smelled of smoke, though nothing burned. The walls sweated condensation, and when I wiped a sleeve across the metal, it came away black, as if soot had seeped through from the inside out. I tried to convince myself I'd survived, that pulling out of that fissure meant I had resisted. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw my own face staring from the wall, lips forming words I had not spoken. My body shook, not from cold, but from the certainty that something had followed me up. At dusk, I heard it again. My footsteps pacing outside the cabin, circling slow and deliberate, not crunching fresh snow, but pressing exactly into the old tracks, repeating them perfectly. I pressed my back against the wall, flare gun ready, pulse roaring in my ears. Then a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps. My own knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice came next, muffled through the thin metal. Not a whisper anymore. Smooth, confident, familiar. My voice. Let me in, Elias. I pressed both hands over my mouth, fighting a scream. Minutes crawled by. Hours, maybe. The pacing continued, sometimes pausing at the door, sometimes circling wide, always in rhythm with my heartbeat. By midnight, the voices seeped through the seams of the cabin like smoke. Not begging, not commanding, just murmuring. Fragments of sentences I had spoken in Naples on expeditions, even as a child. Memories pulled out of me and fed back like poisoned honey. I stuffed cloth into my ears. Useless. The voices pressed through bone. When dawn came, or what passed for dawn here, the world outside was blanketed in silence again. No footprints, no glow from the fissure, just pale snow stretching to the rim. I almost believed it had ended. Almost. But when I picked up the recorder, replayed the tape from last night, my blood froze. The knock, clear. My voice at the door saying, "Let me in, Elias." And then, softer, almost gentle, a new sentence. Words I hadn't heard aloud, but that burrowed into my head like hooks. "We are already inside." I dropped the recorder, bile rising in my throat. Inside. I pressed trembling fingers against my chest, against my skull. What if the fissure didn't need me to descend further? What if bringing its voice back into this cabin, breathing its air, had been enough? The thought festered until I couldn't stay still. I tore the station apart, overturned the cot, smashed the instruments, ripped the recorder free, and hurled it against the wall. Pieces scattered, blinking light finally dead. For a brief, precious moment, silence. Then, from my own lips, a laugh escaped. Short. Familiar, but not mine. I clamped both hands over my mouth, terror spiking, hot and absolute. My lungs convulsed, and the laugh came again, higher this time, layered like 2 voices in one throat. I sank to my knees, staring at the snow drifting in through the cracks of the door. There was no survival here, not in the way I had imagined. The fissure had been right all along. It wasn't calling me down, it was rising through me. And as the hum began again beneath the floor, sinking with my pulse, I realized the haunting would never end with this cabin. When the helicopter came for me, if it came, I would not be leaving this place alone. The decision clawed at me all night. Escape, destruction, surrender. Each one circled my thoughts like wolves. I pressed my forehead to the cold wall of the cabin, listening to the heartbeat under the floor. Stronger now, closer. It throbbed in my veins, synced with every tremor in my chest. By morning, my reflection in the steel instrument panel looked wrong. My face, yes, but the eyes lingered a fraction too long when I moved. The corners of my mouth twitched upward without me commanding it. I smashed the panel with my fist until the warped image disappeared, but I still felt its gaze from the shards. The fissure had been patient. It no longer whispered from below. It whispered from inside. Snatches of thought threaded through my mind that weren't mine. Memories I'd never lived. Standing on the rim decades ago, centuries ago, staring down into the same glow. Faces of men in old coats, women clutching lanterns, hunters with spears. All of them drawn here. All of them consumed. I tried to write, to ground myself. My notebook filled with spirals instead of words, black whorls scrawled so deep the pen tore the paper. I dropped it, horrified, as my hand kept twitching like it wanted to continue. By midday, I was outside again, though I had no memory of deciding to leave. My boots carried me across the snow, crunch by crunch, toward the fissure. The glow beneath was steady, inviting. My harness dangled uselessly at my side. I hadn't clipped it. I stood at the edge, staring down, and for the first time I didn't feel fear. I felt recognition, like looking into a mirror that finally told the truth. Voices rose in unison. "You are ready." My body swayed forward. Heat kissed my face. At the last second, survival screamed. I fired a flare straight into the chasm. Red light erupted, casting the chamber into harsh relief. The walls writhed with faces, mouths wide, and among them I saw myself. Not one, but dozens. Each flare of the light showed me another Elias. Some screaming, some laughing, some silently staring. The flare sputtered. Darkness rushed back. I staggered from the edge, dropping to my knees, gasping in the snow. My throat burned. I realized I had been speaking the whole time, chanting the words the fissure wanted, my own voice carrying promises I hadn't meant to make. Back at the station, I collapsed against the door. My skin smelled of sulfur, my breath of stone. I pressed the last flare to my temple, thumb on the trigger. A single squeeze, and this parasite would end with me. But then the fissure spoke again, not from below, not from outside, but from within my own chest. "If you end, we end. If we end, the world forgets you. Leave, Elias. Carry us back." The words froze me. Leave. Carry. My chest heaved, torn between terror and a grotesque relief. Maybe that was the only way to survive. Take it with me, smuggle it past these walls, deliver it to a world that had no idea what slept here. My hand trembled on the flare gun. My eyes watered. I whispered into the empty cabin, "God help me." And from my own throat, in perfect harmony, another voice answered, "We already do." The last day blurred into a fever dream. I remember pacing the cabin, muttering to myself or to it. I couldn't tell which anymore. Every so often, my voice would answer from a corner of the room I hadn't spoken to, and I stopped questioning if my lips had moved. Snow fell heavy outside, muffling the world. It should have calmed me, but instead it felt like a burial shroud, closing the caldera off from everything beyond. The radio remained a corpse of static. I had no idea if the helicopter was still scheduled to come or if the storm had cut me off for good. I told myself extraction meant survival, but every time the thought came, another thought followed, smooth and certain. Yes. Take us with you. I tore through the station, searching for anything I could use to sever the connection. Bleach, flame, even blunt force. But nothing here could undo what had already been planted. The fissure didn't cling to my skin. It lived in my marrow now, in the quiet corners of my thoughts. At dusk, the storm broke. The air went sharp and clear, and for the first time in days, I could see the rim of the caldera, outlined in pale light. And there, faint, distant, the thrum of rotor blades, the helicopter. My chest heaved, equal parts relief and dread. I stumbled outside, flare gun raised, and fired the last cartridge into the sky. Red burst overhead, staining the snowfield in bloodlight. The blades drew closer, chopping the silence into pieces. I waved both arms, screaming into the emptiness. My own voice echoed back. Too close, too perfect. When I turned, I saw footprints circling me again. Dozens, all mine, all fresh. The fissure pulsed one last time, a faint glow bleeding into the snow, and the voice filled me completely, not outside or inside, but everywhere at once. Good. Lee, we will follow. I fell to my knees while clutching my head, rocking in the snow as the helicopter descended. The wind from its rotors whipped the footprints into chaos, erasing the spirals for now. A figure leaned from the side, shouting my name. Moretti! Elias Moretti! I stumbled toward them, legs weak, vision swimming. My body felt heavier than stone, but some current drove me forward. When they pulled me aboard, the warmth of the cabin should have comforted me. Instead, I felt the fissure humming louder, or carried with me, resonating in the steel of the machine. The pilot shouted something about weather, about how lucky I was. I tried to answer, but my voice broke into two. One part mine, one part not. The others didn't notice. Not yet. I stared through the window as the caldera shrank beneath us, the fissure just a dark wound in the snow. It looked small, contained. But I knew better. I felt it pulsing inside me in every breath, every heartbeat. As the horizon opened wide and civilization waited beyond the mountains, the whisper coiled through my thoughts. Steady as prayer, we are already home.